Welcome to the Roadmap Project's webinar on Washington State K-12 funding. This is a very quick 101 on a very complex topic. We really appreciate you joining us. My name's Mary Jean Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Center for Education Results, CCER. We're the nonprofit organization which staffs the Roadmap Project. Our main webinar presenter today is Haid Garrett. Haid works for a consulting firm called 3SI, which CCER and a number of our partner organizations retained to help us learn how our state education funding system works. We call the project Follow the Money. Before I turn it over to Haid, let me just explain a little bit about the Roadmap Project. The Roadmap Project's a collective impact initiative aimed at getting dramatic improvement in student achievement, cradle through college and career in South Seattle and South King County. If you're not familiar with the Roadmap Project, you can find just a ton of information about it on our website, roadmapproject.org. The Roadmap Project's geographic area of focus is South King County and South Seattle. These are King County's areas with the highest concentrations of children living in poverty. We know that money alone can't boost academic achievement, but we do believe that resources matter and that wise investments can help mitigate the effects of concentrated poverty. We commissioned the Follow the Money project because we wanted to understand how the state's K-12 education funding system works, or in some cases doesn't work, so that we can better advocate for the students in our region. It's now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Haid Garrett.
Thanks, MJ. All right, today's webinar, we're going to discuss three main topics. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of basic education funding in our state. Second, we want to define for you what basic education is in our state. And third, we want to talk about the prototypical school model, which is the main mechanism for funding basic education in our state. First, why is education funding such a challenging issue in our state? Our state's constitution makes it the legal obligation of the legislature to provide ample funding for basic education. And not only are they legally bound, but it is their paramount duty. While the obligation is clear, the legislature has struggled to define basic education and determine what ample funding is. While most people are familiar with the McCleary decision of 2012, our state's struggle with funding basic education goes back 40 years. You can see that there have been numerous court cases and pieces of legislation that have been passed leading up to the McCleary decision. And this is an issue that our state continues to struggle with today. While the focus of this webinar is on state funding and how the state funds basic education, we do want to note that there are few main sources of funds available to school districts. The first and the largest source of funds are state funds, and these are intended through our Constitution to fully fund basic education. The second source of funding is local funds, and those are mainly local levy funds. And legally, these are intended to pay for enhancements to basic education. Third, federal funds can be used to supplement basic education programs targeted at specific student populations. While levy funds are intended to enhance basic education, the levy lid has almost tripled in the past 40 years. This has allowed districts to create a yearly reliance on these funds to fill the gap between what the state pays and a district's true cost. Given the continuing struggle in our state to define and fund basic education, what is the current context today? The Washington State Legislature remains in contempt of court for failing to present a comprehensive plan to fully fund basic education. However, in the past two legislative sessions, significant new investments for basic education have been made. But the legislature has not yet addressed school staff compensation, the biggest expense for districts and one of the McCleary mandates. Finally, it is still unclear how the legislature will address the levy cliff and put an end to the use of local levy dollars for basic education. In the next section of this webinar, we'd like to provide a definition of basic education in our state. Substitute House Bills 2261 and 2776 provide the foundation, the definition, funding model, funding values, and a funding timeline for basic education. So 2261 provides the definition of the programs. It officially adopted the prototypical school model as the funding mechanism and provides a timeline for which the legislature will need to fully fund the model. It created a new formula for pupil transportation, increasing funding, and established work groups to continue to define and implement the details of the funding formulas. Coupled with Substitute House Bill 2776, this bill provides the funding values for the prototypical school model and prioritizes 4 areas for full funding by 2017-18. Those areas are full day kindergarten, the K-3 class size reduction, full funding for MSOC, materials, supplies, and operating costs, and pupil transportation. While it is true that most news about education funding in our state focuses on the McCleary decision and the funding gap, it should be noted that the legislature has added over $2 billion in funding for basic education over the past 4 years. This pie chart shows how the funding is broken out among the programs of basic education. In addition to the pie chart, in the 2015-17 biennium, the legislature added an additional compensation for salary enhancements and health benefit enhancements for school staff. But this increase should not be confused with addressing school staff compensation, one of the McCleary mandates. But it's important to track those investments against the legislature's plan for implementing full funding for basic education. So we can see by the 2017-18 school year, the legislature does have plans to fully fund their 4 areas of focus, but missing from this plan is increased funding for school staff compensation at higher levels, noted as the biggest expense for school districts. Now that we have a common definition of basic education in our state, we want to review the prototypical school model and how funding for basic education works. So again, general entitlement dollars, those dollars that fund school staff in the buildings, is our largest portion and is funded through the prototypical school model, including a per student MSOC allocation. This webinar will focus on understanding how the prototypical school model funds general entitlement dollars. And for more detailed and technical information about special education and categorical programs and student transportation, you can visit the CCER website. So what is the prototypical school model? The prototypical school model provides staffing levels for specific positions at certain enrollment levels. And currently, the prototypical school model includes positions for administrators such as principals, certificated staff such as teachers, librarians, guidance counselors and nurses, and classified staff such as teaching assistants, office support, student and staff safety, and parent involvement coordinators. Each position has a specific funded value for full-time staff depending on the type of school, whether it be an elementary, middle, or high school. And again, just like these are general entitlement dollars, and they are allocation only. What this means is that if a district receives funding for 5 guidance counselors, they do not have to hire and fund 5 guidance counselors. They can use the dollars largely at their discretion. So what does a prototypical school look like? Here we see the values for those positions for what is considered a prototypical high school in Washington State. In Washington State, a prototypical high school is 600 students, and they receive funding for approximately 25 classroom teachers, all the way down through 0.141 of a person for student and staff safety, and as well as $1,300 per student in MSOC dollars. But again, because these dollars are allocations only, districts have a lot of flexibility in how they choose to spend these dollars. So what could that flexibility look like? You can consider 3 different districts. District A could use their funding for 25 classroom teachers and have 23 classroom teachers and choose to hire a gym teacher and an art teacher. While their neighboring district, District B, could use the funding to have 24 teachers and divide the funding for the 25th teacher into supplementing a full-time librarian and a full-time nurse, depending on their priorities. While District C could use the money for 2 teachers to provide additional computers within a high school. But while flexibility provides districts the ability to meet the needs of their students, there are also 2 key challenges to the prototypical school model that are important to understand when considering basic education funding in our state. The first challenge that's important to consider is that the prototypical school model assumes uniformity in student need. And what this means is that a student in poverty will generate the same amount of resources or funding as their wealthier counterparts. So when we consider the positions in the prototypical school model, students in poverty will produce the same number of guidance counselors, the same number of nurses, and the same number of teachers as their wealthier counterparts in a district. The second challenge to consider is that districts with higher levels of poverty may receive less per student teacher funding. Because teacher funding is provided based on a teacher's average experience and tenure, districts with higher level of poverty may struggle to attract and retain staff. And resource allocations based on current staff tenure and experience may challenge a district's ability to leverage resources toward attracting and retaining staff. So 2 districts, A and B, with the same number of students, but one, District B, with almost double the level of poverty and less experienced teacher staff, will receive the same number of instructional staff, but less instructional staff dollars per student. This ends our webinar and our 101 review of basic education funding in the state, and I'll now turn it back over to Mary Jean.
Thanks, Hayde. That was great information. To recap real quick, here are some of the big takeaways. The state is not fully funding basic education. It's relying instead on school districts to pass local property tax levies to pay for significant portions of teacher and administrator compensation. This practice has become like a 40-year bad habit that's hard to stop. Even in recent years, as the legislature has added billions of new state money, it has still kept on raising the levy caps, which has had the effect of digging the state an even deeper hole. The continuous raising of levy caps by the legislature has taken pressure off the state to step up to its constitutional responsibility. The Supreme Court is now demanding that the state fully fund basic education, including compensation, and end the over-reliance on local levies. The prototypical school funding model uses an allocation funding method, which means that districts have tremendous flexibility in how they use the resources that are provided. They don't have to use the funds at the school level in the same categories as the state provides. The prototypical funding model assumes uniformity in student need. Students in poverty do not receive any additional funding. This despite research which shows how hard it is to overcome the effects of concentrated poverty. As we said at the outset of this webinar, this was just meant to be a quick overview of some of the basics of Washington State's very complex K-12 education funding system. The full Follow the Money PowerPoint deck is on the Roadmap Project website. Check it out if you want to go deeper. There is also a technical appendix to Follow the Money, which explains how the state considers poverty in K-12 funding. We really thank you for tuning in to this webinar. We hope you found this information to be helpful, and we urge you to get involved in these important issues. We all need to work together to create the education funding system that the children of our state deserve.